As military professionals, you need the best self-development and leadership tools on the market. So stop by mentormilitary.com. They have everything you can possibly imagine when it comes to professional development, including products and software that help you quickly develop professional and individualized counseling statements, evaluation reports, awards, standard operating procedures, classes, and they even specialize in military gifts. Enter YT, that's Yankee Tango 10 at checkout and get 10% off your order. Team, welcome to another episode of Ask Top, sponsored by MentorMilitary.com. Today we've got a special guest, Major General Mike Milano, and we're going to be talking about his book, Large and in Charge No More. I recommend it. It's a great leadership book. If you get the opportunity, purchase it at MentorMilitary.com. Here's what it looks like. Let me back that up a little bit. Large and in charge no more, a journey to vulnerable leadership. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and bring Major General Mike Milano on. Stand by. Hey, sir, how you doing today?
I'm doing great, Mark. How are you?
Pretty good. So want to go ahead and cut straight to the chase if we could. And can you give the audience a little bit of background about your military career and then what you did after retiring?
Absolutely. And thanks for having me on, Mark. I had a great 33-year career in the United States Army on active duty. I was an armored cavalry officer, commanded at all levels, up to include installation command. My last 8 years in the Army were as a general officer, and I had 3 commanding general jobs during that time frame. I retired from the Army with the privileged rank of Major General. I retired in 2012, and I went to work for Target Corporation. I went to work in their retail logistics and supply business. I knew nothing about that. They hired me ostensibly because of my leadership skills, but they brought me on board, and I had a great 7-year run with Target Corporation. I learned a lot about leadership with that company. Mark, I like to say I went from one values-based organization, the Army, to another values-based organization, Target. I really enjoyed working for that company. And then in 2019, I retired from Target for a couple of reasons. One was to help my wife finish her doctorate. She'd been pursuing that for many years, but had trouble doing it given all the moving around we did, 20 plus moves in 30 years or so. But I helped her get that ball over the goal line. And at the same time, a good friend and mentor of mine, Lieutenant General retired Rick Lynch, contacted me and asked me if I'd be interested in conducting leadership tours with him. We conduct leadership tours at Gettysburg, Vicksburg, Chickamauga, Little Bighorn. We go to Selma, Alabama to look at the 1965 voting rights marches. They're leadership tours, Mark, where we look at what the leaders do, why they do it, and what can we learn from that. And I've been doing that for 4.5 years. So those 2 reasons, I decided to retire from Target. And I also served for 3 years as the senior coach on the Army's leader training program in Hohenfels, Germany, helping train Army Brigade Combat Team commanders. And I also, of course, wrote the book. That was about a 3-year process. And so I currently do some speaking about the book. But I got to tell you, one thing I'm very proud of is my role as a supporter to my wife, who's a full-time professor at North Central College here in Naperville, Illinois. It feels good to do something to, quote, pay her back for all the sacrifices she made on my behalf during my career. So I'm working part-time plus to support her, and I feel pretty good about that.
That's awesome, sir. So how is the book applicable to our audience, both military and civilian?
Well, it's about leadership. And I think each one of us in our personal, professional lives, we are leading in some capacity every day. If you look at leading as inspiring people to get something done to accomplish a task, we do that all the time. And none of us is perfect. We are all works in progress when it comes to leading. And I learned a lot based on my 7 years with Target Corporation relative to my Army career. I learned a lot about leadership. It really broadened my horizons. And I wanted to contribute to the discussion and specifically look at the power, the skill, the effectiveness of vulnerability as a leadership strength. It's not a weakness. When you consider vulnerability, when you look it up in the dictionary, it refers to people being assailable, open to attack, compromised, if you will. It doesn't discuss it as a strength, but I consider it a strength, and I'm not the only one. I'm a big fan of Brene Brown's. So I wanted to contribute to that and give some examples of instances in my military and civilian career when I was vulnerable and I didn't realize it, when I wasn't vulnerable, what the consequences were. So I think it's a practical application of another tool in a leader's kit bag about how they can be an effective leader. And I'll give you an example. I prize greatly, of all the things from the military, all the relationships, I prize greatly my relationships from every step of the way with my non-commissioned officer partners, my platoon sergeants, first sergeants, command sergeants, major, and so forth. And it really struck home to me when I showed up, Mark, at Fort Hood, Texas, as a second lieutenant. I was a chemical engineering major in college. So I figured, Einstein that I was, I'm going to go in the chemical corps and I'm going to use my degree in the Army. And after I pay back my 4 years, I'm going to get out and make a gazillion bucks as a chemical engineer. That didn't work out. And the other thing is that when I showed up at 2nd Armored Division, the policy was if you weren't combat arms, you were going to serve as a combat arms platoon leader for 6 months. So I ended up in a tank platoon, chemical officer Milano, tank platoon leader. I knew nothing about tanks.
Awesome.
Zippo. But there I was large and in charge of that tank platoon. And thank goodness I had a platoon sergeant who took me under his wing, Calvin C. Bailey. I'll never forget that. I trusted that man with my development. He taught me what it meant to be a good armored platoon leader, so much so that I ended up branch transferring later on. But I trusted him. I empowered him. I listened to him. I sought his advice. And that lesson, Mark, stayed with me for the rest of my career. I always made my senior non-commissioned officers valued members of my team. They were field grade officers in my mind. I sought their advice. I confided in them. I empowered them. That's what vulnerable leadership is. It's trusting others. It's bringing them into your circle. I call vulnerability, Mark, allowing others to peek under the tent flap of who we are. I didn't say move into the tent. I said peek under the tent flap of who we are. And I use, so from a military perspective, officers and the relationships with the non-commissioned officers is a great opportunity to exercise vulnerable leadership. You don't have it all figured out. That individual has a lot that he or she can teach you. And then I would say in the civilian world, vulnerability is a valued skill set because we live in a volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world. And the pace of change is off the charts. It's exponential. No one individual can keep up with it all. You are going to have to rely on others to sort things out, to get answers, to accomplish projects. You're going to have to bring other people in. And it takes vulnerability to do so, to establish that trust, that common connection with people, if you want to be successful. So I think the book has applicability both in a military and a civilian context. Because we all, if we're honest with ourselves, are reliant on others and have relied on others for the successes that we've enjoyed.
One of the things I remember, you discussed being a second lieutenant in a tank platoon, not knowing what you were doing. But when somebody saw you as a second lieutenant in an armor unit, they expected you to know what a second lieutenant had to know about a tank platoon.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And so it was what you wore on your chest that there were assumptions about what your knowledge base should be.
Right. And I was wearing chemical officer brass. So they knew that, oh my God, we got our hands full with this one here. So I had to prove myself. And thankfully I had some peers and superiors and people like, Staff Sergeant Calvin C. Bailey, who helped me along the way. I wouldn't have succeeded otherwise. As you very well know, a tank can do a lot of damage. It can hurt you in a nanosecond if you're not careful. But I had an absolute blast those 6 months leading the tank. So much so that I said, I think this is what I want to do. And so I ended up, as I said, branch transferred.
Well, sir, how did you come up with the name for your book and what inspired you to write it?
Yeah. Well, tell you a little story. When I left the Army and went to Target Corporation, as I said, I knew nothing about retail logistics and supply chain. I happened to meet somebody at a horse race who was connected to some people high up in Target. Next thing I know, I'm interviewing, liked what I was hearing, liked what I saw, ended up joining the company. But I knew Zippo. Uh, and when I came on board, the man who hired me, Mitch Stover, said, Mike, learn our culture because it's very different from what you're coming from. Trust us, we will teach you the business. And they did. And it took a couple of years, Mark, for me to get comfortable running my business. My peers 7 years later could run circles around me because they'd grown up, a lot of them had grown up in the company. So I knew nothing about it. I was completely reliant on others to help me succeed. But I was in charge of that facility. I was responsible for the profit margins. I was responsible for safety. I needed a lot of help doing so. And when I think about that, when I took over as the commanding general of the Coalition Police Advisory Training Team in Iraq, before I joined Target, obviously, David Petraeus, I deployed over there as the assistant division commander of the 4th Infantry Division in 07. 8 or 9 months in, Petraeus tells me, congratulations, Mike, we're going to promote you to Major General and you're going to make you the next commanding general of the Police Advisory Training Team. I said, sir, are you sure you got the right guy? I don't know anything about policing. He said, no, you're it. I didn't know anything about policing, rule of law, forensics-based analysis, preserving crime scenes, but I was in charge. And thankfully, I had about 400 policemen and women from around the world who helped me understand what that was all about. So given a title, given a position, people are assumed to be large and in charge, when in fact, they may not know what the hell they're doing, and they're very reliant on other people. So my 7 years with Target, I really got to thinking about what I learned about leadership. And when I went to work with Rick Lynch, I was talking to him about this, and he said, you need to write a damn book. And I said, yeah, sure, like I have the time. Well, he's written a couple of books, and they're very good, by the way. His book, Adapt or Die, is awesome. But he kept bugging me. He said, no, write a book. Come on, you can do it. And he pushed me. And I'm so thankful he did so. And it took about 3 years. I started putting thoughts on paper, hired my co-author, who's my wife's twin sister. She's a writer. And we got it done. But thankfully, he pushed me because he thought it was a pretty good perspective on leadership that really hadn't been talked about much. So that's where the idea came from. And then the push to get it done came from a very good friend of mine and mentor.
Well, you talk about relying on others. And one thing that I found was during my time in the service, you needed to delegate to the subject matter experts. And those that failed to delegate and hold on and try to control things didn't necessarily do well.
Right.
So delegation is a big thing, I believe, and trust comes with that delegation.
Totally. We've all heard we can delegate responsibility. I'm going to empower you to make that decision. But delegate authority, excuse me. But you can't delegate responsibility.
Absolutely.
And I think you're exactly right. Delegation is how you develop people. Put them in charge of something and see what they can do.
So what can a reader expect to gain from reading your book?
I think they can gain a better understanding of what effective leadership looks like. And I'd like to do a little exercise with you, if you don't mind.
No, sir. Go ahead.
To envision in your mind's eye a person you have worked with, worked for, somebody you worked with, somebody who focused more, Mark, on telling you what needed to be done rather than how. Somebody, when you think about it, you actually knew pretty well some things about them personally. Somebody who took a genuine interest in you and your development. Somebody who shared successes. They willingly put other people on the spotlight when things are going well, but stepped forward first and foremost when things weren't going well. Somebody who could admit failure. Yeah, I screwed that one up. That's on me. So put that face of that person in your mind. And now I want you to envision a second person. in your mind's eye, okay? Somebody who focused more on telling you how to do things versus what, because they wanted it done their way. Somebody who, when you think about it, you really didn't know. Somebody who was a micromanager or a control freak. Somebody who was a poor listener, easily distracted. And somebody you could never envision uttering the words, gee, I didn't know that. Now, when you take those two people in your mind, which one would you rather work for?
Definitely the one that was looking out to develop me and share knowledge.
Yeah, the former. And I would maintain that that person understands something about what it means to be a vulnerable leader. One of the interesting things I see this in some of the consulting I do and the coaching I've done and so forth is that I love it when leaders say, you know what, we screwed this up and I'm going to take the hit on it. I gave you lousy guidance that led to poor results. I pulled the trigger too quickly on moving to the next phase of the operation without all the information I really should have had. I didn't train you all adequately enough. I under-resourced this particular effort. Man, I love hearing that because no organizational failure or setback, in none of those cases, is the leader blameless. They have a role to play. Vulnerable leaders will honestly assess their role in that setback or failure and then take action to fix it. What do invulnerable leaders do? They point fingers, they blame others, they blow their top, they fire folks without honestly assessing their role in that setback or failure. And so I think what people can get out of this book is a way to understand vulnerability is this, Mark. It's establishing common ground with people. It's building relationships. And relationships are what lead to engagement. And engagement is vital. And if you don't mind, I'd like to tell you a little story about engagement.
Oh, go ahead, sir.
Every year, Gallup does a survey. It's called the State of the Global Workplace. And it's a very extensive survey. It's almost 100 countries, over 100,000 business units. And one of the things they look at is engagement. And they've been measuring this for years. Globally, workers are 23% engaged globally. So you have engaged, not engaged, actively disengaged. The biggest pile is not engaged. 23% of workers around the world are engaged. US were number one. 33% engagement. Flip that around. That means that 2/3 of our workers are not engaged at work to some extent or another. That's pretty abysmal when you think about it. And you know what the correlation is between higher engagement scores and absenteeism? There's less absenteeism. There's less turnover. There are fewer safety incidents. There's higher profit margins. There's a direct correlation between engagement and a lot of business metrics. I would maintain that engagement sucks in a lot of cases because leaders don't know how to be vulnerable. They don't know how to let others peek under that tent flap of who they are. They very erroneously believe in this strict separation of personal and professional lives. That's a bunch of baloney. Issues in one are going to impact the other. And people mistakenly believe they can keep the two totally separate. Again, I didn't say move into the tent. I said peek under the tent flap of who we are. But I think it starts with understanding how to be vulnerable and how that leads to better engagement, how it leads to better trust, how it leads to being viewed as authentic, having integrity, and so forth. Does that make sense to you, what I said?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I remember a key leader I had that shared something with me that really stuck. Hog the blame and share the glory.
Yeah.
And they were very adamant that when something went wrong, it was on you.
Right.
And you sucked that up because you were the person in charge.
There's an organization, Mark, called Trust Outlook, and they also do an annual report looking at trust in society and organizations and so forth. 92% of people would trust their senior leader more if they were more transparent about their mistakes. That's
Yeah, absolutely. I can think of a colonel I worked for coming out of, I came out of a very bad leadership situation where I had lost trust and confidence in senior leaders, with the exception of my brigade commander. And I was like, oh no, man, this is going to be terrible. It turned out I worked for one of the best leaders I ever worked for, and his civilian deputy was awesome. What I learned from those two was, hey, we need to change a mindset because we got leaders like this.
Yeah.
Just a phenomenal, those two were just phenomenal leaders that changed my perspective.
Right. Yeah. I can think back on leaders I've worked for who were pretty honest about, like when I went to deploy to Bosnia, I was a G3 of 1st Cav Division. This was in 1998. My boss, my commanding general at the time, I absolutely love the man, Kevin Burns. Uh, it was a very complex situation over there in Bosnia, enforcing the Dayton Peace Accords and all that. He'd say, I'm not sure what we need to be doing here, but give me options. Give me some options. Yeah. He wasn't directing this, directing that, because it was a pretty complex situation. He said, I need options. And that's what his staff, we in the staff gave him. Because we weren't sure what needed to be done. We had to come up with some ideas and then analyze them.
Absolutely. One of the things I used to share with my teams was I don't like yes people. I need somebody that's going to tell me no in a professional way and share options.
Yes. And that person in my world was usually my command sergeant major. I had that kind of relationship. That individual was the one who could come in, shut the door, and say, so what the hell is that? Why didn't you run that one by me? I could have helped you with this. And I only need to hear that a couple of times. But that was the individual that had the authority to come in and do that. And
I really enjoyed the leaders that allowed me to close the door with a good professional and personal relationship and say, hey, what's going on? How did we get here?
Yes.
And they were like, okay, Sergeant Major, we got it. And we're going to fix that.
Yes.
So, sir, in the book, you talk about vulnerable leadership. Can you share with the audience what that means and why it's important? We've covered a lot of that, but is there anything specific you want to share?
I think it takes a lot of courage to drop your armor and admit that you're fearful in a situation, you're uncertain about what to do. This makes you uncomfortable. And it's okay to do that because guess what? Everybody else experiences the same kind of things. There are no supermen or superwomen among us as human beings. They just don't exist. But that willingness to listen to others, as you just talked about, to not surround yourself with yes men, to value something we're going to talk about here in a second, feedback, which was probably the single biggest takeaway I got from Target was the value of feedback. First of all, you got to want feedback. And two, you got to do something with it. So vulnerability is realizing that it's okay to not have everything figured out. That doesn't mean you're not in charge. That doesn't mean you don't make decisions. That doesn't mean you don't have high standards. But it's okay to take some time to figure things out or seek some outside help. When I was with Target, you had as an organization, you had to have problems you were trying to solve. If you didn't have problems, you weren't looking hard enough. So they were celebrated when the higher ups would come visit us. We laid out our problems, what we're doing about it. It was all right, good job, awesome, way to dig deep. Not a lot of organizations do that. And a lot of our problems, value stream analysis, I didn't know how to solve them. So I had to bring in some folks, some outside experts to help solve that. And I was proud to. But it's what you talked about, bringing in that subject matter expertise to help you. Even though I was responsible for the operation, I needed some help in figuring it out. And Target celebrated that. They expected you to collaborate. They expected it. There were no Lone Rangers in that organization. And you shared best practices. Hey, Ted, let me tell you about something we're doing here that's really increased our productivity in this particular phase of operation. Oh man, Mike, thanks for sharing that. That's a cool leadership environment right there. But to me, it just oozes vulnerability, frankly.
I believe I was successful in my career for two reasons. One were the people around me that made me look good. I was standing on their shoulders, but they're the ones that made sure I looked good to my boss. So I was always caring about them, but also my spouse. Patty really supported me when I'd have a rough day, and I could pick myself up and go back in and face something.
Yes. I think uh, another aspect of being a vulnerable leader, Mark, is that you're willing to empower people. You're willing to assign a task, a mission, establish the left and right limits, paint a vision of what success looks like. Here's the resources. Here's when I'm going to check in. Here's the timeline. Now get after it and make it happen. I love
Absolutely.
I love that. Versus, and some of the brigade combat team commanders I've coached over the years, they're wading down into levels that they have no business down there. Just give mission type orders. Stop trying to control every single thing that's going on, because you and I both know no plan survives first contact. So give yourself some flexibility, but empower those subordinates to figure it out, make decisions, and then be willing to underwrite well-intentioned failure. Now there are some zero defects regarding safety in particular, right? But
Yes.
well-intentioned failure that's not going to bring the organization to its knees, you got to learn from that. A vulnerable leader will.
I
Um,
remember one time in a leadership event, a gentleman came in and we had jars with big rocks, little rocks, and sand. And he said, put these into the jar so that everything fits. And what I got out of that exercise was figure out what your big rocks are, give mid-level leaders the little rocks that they find out, and then the soldiers execute the sand, and that's the only way it fit.
yep, that's a great point. And there's this thing you've probably heard of it called the Eisenhower box. It's prioritization and time management. And essentially, it says you should, as a leader, do only those things that only you can do.
Hmm.
Otherwise, delegate. Because every one of us, Mark, has a responsibility to train that next generation of leaders. I love asking leaders, hey, if something happened to you today, who's taking your place and what have you done to set that person up for success? I can't just simply designate you as my successor. That just starts the process. I now have a whole ton of work to do to get you prepared to do that. I did that when I left Target. I started a year out preparing my successor once I got that individual approved by my chain of command there. But leader development is the most important, the most vital thing that we do. And I think a lot of times it gets short shrift. I was talking to a cousin of mine that works for a Fortune 100 company. Just talking to him a couple of weeks ago. I said, tell me about your leader development program. Do you guys have a leader development program? And he's mid-level management. He said, I don't know. I need to check. Well, that means there isn't one.
Right.
So
So one of the chapters in the book you talk about, and you mentioned it earlier, was mastering feedback.
yeah,
What tips do you have for that you can share with the audience with regard to mastering feedback?
yeah. So that I love this because it was really another part of Target's culture that I learned so much about. But it's a gift. Feedback is a gift because, as I said up front, none of us is a perfect leader. We're all works in progress, and we all have things, if we're honest with ourselves, that we could do better. Whether that's reacting to bad news, whether that's giving good guidance, whether that's public speaking, whether that's whatever. Let me give you an example. Um, I was conditionally hired with Target for the first few months to make sure I was a good cultural fit. And it wasn't until I interviewed with the CEO a few months later that I was, officially in. Well, after a few months in the role, my HR partner, Allie, said, Mike, let's talk. Let's take a walk. I used to like to walk and talk. Um, she said, there's some things you're doing behaviorally and some things you say that are frankly disengaging. They're putting people off. I said, because I consider myself a pretty engaging person. He said, well, for example, a lot of times you stand with your hands on your hips. Just the classic military large and in charge pose, right? We all do this, walking around with our hands on our hips. Or cross my arms when I'm talking about.
Oh, absolutely.
This is
That's me.
Or I'd be at an angle talking to somebody and not, fully facing them. Sometimes I didn't listen well. When I told my wife that one, she said, well, duh, I've been telling you that for years. And I'm loud, okay? I can be intimidating. But these were all things that were fine in the Army. But in the target culture, they weren't working so hot. So I said, wow, Allie, I had no idea. She said, I know, but that's why I'm telling you this. And so she turned into my feedback partner. I said, I want to get better at these things. So I want some feedback from you periodically and how I'm doing at working on these things. Because I had no idea. But feedback, Mark, helps us discover our blind spots. We all have them. Blind spots are things known to others, but not known to us. We all have them. And only if you are willing to ask for and act on feedback are you going to discover what those are. And I would maintain that the act of giving feedback and receiving it is a vulnerable action on both people's parts. It's uncomfortable telling somebody, I don't really like it when we're talking and you're scrolling through your phone. That means you're paying attention to me, okay? Or it doesn't have to be all negative, by the way, but if you want constructive feedback, if you want to get better, as you know, sustain the things you do well, and let's focus on the things that I could get better at. So I consider feedback a gift. And it was an expectation in Target's culture that feedback went down laterally and upwards. When we would go visit other facilities to see their operation, a requirement was I gave some feedback to my counterpart. Hey, gee, Ted, in the update meeting, you did all the talking. You got some pretty talented people on your team. Have you thought about letting them contribute? Or you answered so-and-so's question that she was asked. And so things like that, and it wasn't all negative, but it's an art giving feedback. But you got to be willing to want it, and you got to act on it. So, but it was part of the culture. I honestly did not have any feedback that I can recall from my major general peers in the Army. Mike, you're a little harsh in that interaction. It just wasn't baked into the culture. We had this thing called a 360-degree assessment.
The MSAT, right?
It was all anonymous. It was all fluff. It didn't help me as an individual and how I personally led. But when I consider those 7 years with Target, I really got a lot out of that time. It really broadened my aperture on what effective leadership looks like.
I remember I got out and I went to work for an engineering firm to handle their logistics. And my president of the company came by one day and he said, you degreened really quick. Well, wow. And then I go home and I tell my wife and my daughter, they go, no, that ain't happening. Somebody sees something in you that we don't. You're still in the Army. And I guess it took me about 18 months, 24 months to kind of really degreen. But that president, who was a retired lieutenant colonel, took me under his wing and just started teaching me.
Yeah.
And they hired me, like I said, to do logistics. And 2 months later, the president calls and says, hey, Mark, congratulations, you're the general manager. I was like, hey, boss, we agreed when I came on board, I wasn't in a leadership role anymore. And he said, nobody asked you. And you will be in charge. Your boss will be down shortly to discuss compensation package. And he hung up the phone. I was like, dude, what just happened? Because this isn't what we agreed to. But he saw something in me and he was willing to mentor me. And I never forgot that.
That's powerful. What a great story. But you see, you and I are both products of a unique culture. And we all adapt to the cultures that we are part of. I had to do some adapting with Target's culture. And it took me a while to forget, to unlearn some of those habits, mannerisms, and so forth that were just so natural in the Army culture.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So in the book, there's a chapter on understanding emotion, which
Yep.
I think is very important in today's culture. We got to get the right message to the right people at the right time. We've got things that weren't necessarily out there when you and I were there. Social media, uh, people sharing stuff that you would never think would be shared. So it's important that we understand emotions and how they impact us. What can you share about that?
Totally. Yeah, this is one of my favorite topics. I think, and the tagline on that chapter is vulnerability means harnessing emotions. And what do I mean by that? Well, we're all emotional beings. We are motivated to act based on emotions. And there's a whole laundry list of possible human emotions. But to me, that's kind of useless because, as a lot of people have pointed out, all those emotions can combine in certain ways to where it's like an endless list of emotions that we go through. We are emotional beings. So I think the first thing a leader has to understand is what's your emotional makeup? Do you walk around looking as though you're angry all the time? Are you too frivolous when it should be serious time? Do you know how to have fun? So you got to understand your own emotional. How do you react to bad news? Do you immediately fix blame, blow your top? Do you have a temper issue? So I think we first and foremost have to understand our emotions, and then second, we have to understand we work with human beings who also have emotions. So let's say you've got 3 or 4 direct reports, and they're all competing for that promotion position. Maybe another facility or whatever. One of them gets it, 3 of them don't. Those 3 you didn't get are going to be disappointed. That's an emotion, disappointment. What are you as a leader going to do, given the fact they're going through it a little bit of an emotional rough time right now? You're just going to say, "Oh, suck it up, better luck next time." Not if you want to be an effective leader, you're not. So you got to understand that emotions play a role in virtually every interaction that we have. And when I got selected for Brigadier General, Mark, we went to this thing called Charm School where they teach you how to be a general,
Absolutely.
right? We went and visited 2 headquarters to see contrasting management styles, organizational culture. Exxon was one of them, very straight laced. Everybody in white shirts, ties. Rarely did you see anybody crack a smile. It just didn't seem like a lot of fun to work there. Great company and all that, don't get me wrong. Then we went to Southwest headquarters. Oh my God, they were having a blast. And this is 2003, 2004. They knew how to have fun, but they also knew how to run a darn good business, Southwest Airlines. I know they had some problems last year at holiday time, but it's kind of interesting in one organization figuring out how to have fun and the other one didn't seem to be having a lot of fun. But as I said earlier about this whole trust and inspire, people want to feel appreciated. They want to feel valued. You want people can't wait to get into work or can't wait to sign on to the Zoom meeting or whatever, because most work models are hybrid now. So understand that you have an emotional makeup, and I think an important part of vulnerability, Mark, is if you have to boil it down to 2 things. One, it's empathy, and the other is self-awareness. Empathy is being able to put yourself in someone else's shoes and understand things from his or her perspective. Truly trying to do that. Well, that means understanding the emotions that they may be experiencing based on what's going on. And then self-awareness is how are you reflecting off of people? We all are sending out signals all the time. Self-aware people understand how they're impacting other people. And a lot of our emotional makeup dictates how we reflect on people. When I took over as commanding general of Fort Knox, Kentucky, I think it was August of 2009, after I got back from Iraq. About a month later, we did our 9/11 memorial service. And I got up there to speak, and I said, I want to tell you all a story that I think is a great example of patriotism that I just heard this morning. Well, the Fort Knox football team, a couple of days before, had played an away game. Fort Knox football team stunk. Small school, a lot of turnover. They hadn't won a game in years. Okay. But the school that they played away, their band was at some kind of band competition. So there was no band there. So they weren't going to do the national anthem before the game. Except the football players on the Fort Knox team decided on their own to go out on the field and sing the national anthem a cappella. Nobody told them to do it. They just went out and did it. Now, everybody in the stands was participating in all that. And as I was telling that story, I started tearing up. I started getting choked up. I don't know if it was because of, 20 plus months deployed. Maybe I think I have a little PTSD, but I react in certain situations. I tear up something. It took me a bit of time to compose myself because that story meant so much to me that those kids, 15, 16, 17-year-olds, would take it upon themselves to do that. Wow, that was powerful. And I said, oh, Christ, people probably thinking, what's up with this guy, Mr. Weepy or whatever. But people afterwards came up and said, man, I really appreciate you showing some emotion there. But it's not something to be celebrated in the Army culture, right? 2-star general. But I couldn't help it. And I dealt with it, but I couldn't help it. It's what I felt at the moment because I was so inspired by what those kids did. But it's okay to show your emotions.
It's funny that you talk about it that way because what I shared with my team leaders and stuff was you got to know what makes your soldiers tick. Everybody is motivated by something different.
Yeah.
So you need to know their personalities. You need to know something about them. And the other thing we shared was the person behind the soldier. You see the badges, the tabs, the rank, you expect them to know certain things. That person could have just been promoted and they're searching for what they're supposed to do. But when you sit down and spend some time with them and get personal, that's a big impact. But we also found that there were problems that we didn't know about.
Yes. That is so well said. Wow.
So the trust factor there started to build. And instead of coming to the first sergeant or the commander, they started going to squad leaders.
Yep. Any
So,
organization that hopes to be successful, Mark, the foundation must be vulnerability-based trust. If you don't have that, you're not going to be able to resolve conflict. You're not going to be able to collaborate. You're not going to be able to hold each other accountable and so forth. You've got to start with vulnerability-based trust.
sir, is there anything else as we start to wrap up that you'd like to share?
Yeah, just a couple of things. Again, I talk vulnerability as a skill, but there's some cautions and caveats. One is vulnerability is attributional. We don't get to all of a sudden declare ourselves vulnerable. Other people have to attribute that to us. You don't get to wake up one day and say, I'm going to be vulnerable. Now, our actions and our words and so forth will lend others to believe that. But so it's attributable to as well. Second thing is context matters. There's a time and a place. The amount of vulnerability we bring to the workplace depends on a lot of things. Politics, brand, the culture of the organization, Army versus target, okay? It depends on this. You can have a good feel for the situation that you're in terms of how vulnerable you are and when and so forth. The third thing I'd say, Mark, is that understand the difference between strategic vulnerability and authentic vulnerability. Strategic vulnerability, and I wish this was my construct because it's brilliant, but strategic vulnerability is about getting forgiveness, getting favoritism, getting recognition, getting sympathy. We can see through that pretty quickly. We're smart people. We pick up on people's ulterior motives. Authentic vulnerability, by contrast, is about being more inclusive, being less judgmental, being less volatile, being willing to try and be a better leader. So understand the difference and understand your motivation for trying to be a vulnerable person. It's got to be for the right reasons. Then the last thing is I would say, Mark, is beware of oversharing. You can easily do that. Remember, peek under the tent flap, not move into the tent. And I think a leader should have a good feel for how much weight those around him or her, the people can bear. You can easily overshare, and then all of a sudden you lose credibility, you lose the confidence of those you are leading. So you got to be You got to be smart about what you share. It doesn't mean you don't share, but just think it through, I would say. So those are some cautions and caveats about this whole idea about what vulnerable leadership looks like.
Sir, that's well said. And team, as we wrap up today, I hope you enjoyed this discussion with Major General Milano, because I found him to be a humble person that put together some serious information to share that will develop leaders. And as we get ready to wrap up, again, here it is, large and in charge, no more, available at mentormilitary.com. We appreciate you watching, and we hope you look forward to the next episode.
Thanks for having me on, Mark.